My daughter cut off contact with me after the divorce, refusing to hear my perspective. Now, 8 years later, she has reached out to me solely to claim her inheritance. I'm a 54-year-old man, and my daughter, who's 28 now, cut me off after my divorce from my wife, who's 48, 8 years ago. She didn't want to hear my side of what happened back then, and now, after all this time, she reached out to me just to ask about getting her inheritance. It's been a tough road for me since the divorce. My wife and I split up 8 years back, and my daughter chose her mom's side without ever asking how I felt about everything. Even though it's been almost 10 years, I've struggled to come to terms with how things ended up and find peace in my life. Part of that struggle came from my ex-wife trying to ruin my reputation completely, but the bigger hurt was losing my daughter. I loved her so much, and being shut out of her life hit me harder than anything else. Since she was an adult when it happened, there wasn't much I could do to stay in her life unless she wanted me there, and she made it clear she didn't, picking her mother over me without a second thought. I don't have any other family except my mom, who had Alzheimer's disease, so losing my daughter like that was one of the worst things I've ever gone through. I tried reaching out to my daughter several times after the divorce, but she was dead set on sticking with her mom and wouldn't even listen to what I had to say. At one point, my ex-wife even contacted me and threatened to sue me for harassment if I didn't leave our daughter alone, which made me realize I had to stop trying to reach out. For the last 8 years, I've been taking care of my mom and focusing on my job. I've had a few casual relationships here and there, but after the divorce, I just can't fully trust anyone anymore. That's pretty much how my life's been for nearly a decade. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm complaining, but the reason I'm sharing this is because my daughter got in touch with me recently after all these years. I was over the moon when she called, thinking maybe she'd finally realized the divorce wasn't just my fault. It felt especially comforting since my mom passed away not long ago, and I've been dealing with that grief all by myself, hoping for some family connection. A few months after my mom's passing, I got a call from an unknown number, and when I answered, I heard a woman's voice. I didn't recognize it at first, it had been so long since I'd spoken to my daughter, and I was shocked when she told me who she was. She said she saw on Facebook that her grandma had died and wanted to check on me. I was surprised and touched that she'd been keeping an eye on me online. I thanked her for calling, said I was doing okay, and told her I missed her. We talked for a bit, and she suggested meeting in person to catch up instead of just talking on the phone. I was thrilled and agreed right away. We set a time to meet at my house over the weekend. I was really excited to see her after so long, so I'm writing this to share my happiness with anyone who'll listen. I hoped we could rebuild our relationship or at least get to know each other again. When my daughter came over for dinner, I cooked for her because I wanted to make it special. I was nervous and excited when I opened the door, but I didn't recognize her at first. She's changed so much since she was a little girl nearly 10 years ago. We started talking, and even though it felt a little awkward at first, we both opened up after a while. She told me about her life, her job, and I shared what's been going on with me. After dinner, we finally addressed the big issue I'd been avoiding. I asked her why she never bothered to hear my side of the story during the divorce and just sided with her mom by default. I admitted her mom was around more as a parent since she stayed home while I worked long hours in construction, but I always tried to spend as much time with my daughter as I could. My daughter said she regrets how things turned out, that she was too young to think things through clearly and got swayed by how her mom described everything. Basically, my ex-wife made me out to be the worst guy, someone who only cared about himself, and since my daughter never heard my perspective, she just believed her mom. We talked more about it, and things were going well until she told me why she'd really come. We'd been talking for hours when I asked what made her reach out after so long. She looked uncomfortable, but I told her she could be honest with me. Then she said she'd been following me on Facebook and, when she learned her grandma had passed, she thought lawyers would contact her about an inheritance. When no one did, she decided to reach out to me directly. She said she wanted to give me time to grieve but mentioned she's engaged now and could really use some money for wedding expenses. It felt like a punch to the gut. I thought after all these years my prayers were answered, and I'd have family again, but it turned out she didn't care about me, she was just after the inheritance. The ironic thing is, it's not even legally hers, it's all mine, and if she hadn't been so distant all these years, she probably would have gotten most, if not all, of it. I don't care about money, I never have. I live in my own house, don't have fancy hobbies, and buy my clothes from Target. Even if the inheritance wasn't involved, I wouldn't have minded helping with her wedding if she'd asked nicely instead of trying to use me and only caring about the money. All these thoughts raced through my head, but I kept my cool and asked if that was all she wanted. She got defensive and said the inheritance was secondary, that her real goal was to reconnect with me, and she felt terrible for not reaching out while her grandma was alive. She claimed she'd wanted to contact me for years but lacked the courage because she thought I'd never forgive her for cutting me off without an explanation, and she felt manipulated by her mom. But I could see the panic on her face. She was just trying to smooth things over so I'd forgive her, and I suspected she was still after the money. I asked how she knew about an inheritance, and she said a couple of years before the divorce, she visited my late mom, who told her she wanted her to inherit everything from my dad, who died years ago, since she was the only grandchild. I don't have any siblings, and back then, my marriage was fine, so I get why my mom might have said that. If the divorce never happened or my daughter hadn't abandoned me, the money would have been hers, like I mentioned. But realizing she only cared about the money and gave me false hope crushed me. I was devastated but didn't let it show. I figured the best way to test her intentions was to see how she'd react if I said there was no inheritance. I asked how much she expected, and she gave a pretty accurate guess. I could tell she'd planned this out. Then I told her I was sorry to disappoint, but her grandma left everything to me years ago, and I planned to use that money to start a business, so I couldn't help her. I offered to pitch in a few $1,000s of my own money for her wedding, but the disappointment on her face confirmed my worst fears. She said she appreciated the offer, but, as the only grandchild, she deserved at least some of the inheritance because it was her grandma's money. I told her I wished I could help, but my decision was final, and if she wasn't happy with my offer, there was nothing more I could do. She turned bright red and got visibly angry, telling me to reconsider, but I stood firm. That's when she showed her true colors, saying she should have known I'd always be the selfish jerk her mom said I was, and she's glad I'm alone. I looked at her with barely hidden disgust. Her words hurt, but by then, I expected it. I just didn't think she'd be that brutally honest so fast. She started to say more, but I stopped her. I told her I should have known she was just like her mom, only reaching out to ask for something, and using my grief over my mom's death to manipulate me was disgusting, even for someone like her. She tried to respond, but I laughed in her face and said if she hadn't blocked me all those years ago, she would have gotten my texts about her grandma and likely inherited most, if not all, of it. That shocked her. She looked baffled and asked what I meant. I told her to unblock me on her old number so I could resend the undelivered texts. She did, and I sent her all the messages where I begged her to listen to me and told her her grandma had Alzheimer's and I wanted them to meet before she forgot her only grandchild. That was true. Early in her illness, my mom often mentioned my daughter and wanted to see her, and it broke my heart I couldn't make that happen. Now, this ungrateful, cruel child had the nerve to demand inheritance. To her credit, she looked ashamed after reading those messages. She apologized but insisted her grandma would have wanted her to have part of the inheritance, and it's unfair for me to punish her like this. She said she was young during the divorce and didn't know better, or she would have handled things differently, and she genuinely wants to rebuild our relationship. But if I'm selfish now, she wouldn't feel comfortable continuing it. I told her if money is what makes or breaks our relationship, maybe we're better off not having one. I wanted to believe her about rebuilding, I really did, but I couldn't. I said I'd consider giving our relationship another chance, but the inheritance was off the table. She glared at me with pure hatred and left my house. I didn't try to stop her. Since then, I've talked to a few friends. Most think I did the right thing, but one close friend said since I don't care about the money, I should let my daughter have some of it if it means having family again. I don't agree, but I can't stop thinking about it. Should I give my daughter part of my inheritance? Update 1. Hey there, this post got way more responses than I ever expected. I really appreciate all the advice and opinions. They've given me the perspective I needed. I figure I'll start by answering the most common question folks had: what happened during my divorce? I haven't talked about it for years, but I guess it's okay to share now. My wife and I were married for 23 years, and I'd have thought after all that time she wouldn't turn on me, but she did. I don't want to dive into all the details, but I found out she was cheating on me with multiple men. Apparently, it had been going on for years before I caught on. When I discovered it, I was completely heartbroken. I didn't know how to face her, so I started drinking heavily and sleeping around too. I nearly wrecked my whole life. We fought a lot, and I guess the drinking and arguments made it easy for her to convince our daughter to take her side. After nearly a year of living apart like that, we finally had it out and got divorced. Back then, my ex-wife was a journalist and kind of a local celebrity, and she used her influence to try to trash my reputation. She almost succeeded. After the divorce, it took me a long time to stop drinking and get my life back on track. Like I said before, my daughter completely cutting me off didn't help matters at all. I'll admit, when I found out about my ex's affairs, I lost it for a while and wasn't there for my daughter as a parent, even during the time we were separated and for about a year after the divorce. I pretty much kept to myself and wasn't around for her. But once I sobered up and got my life together, the first thing I did was reach out to her and apologize, but she refused to listen, blocked me everywhere. I thought giving her some space would work, and she'd eventually come around, but here we are, 8 years later, and things between us have only gotten worse. Now, about the other big question, my mom's inheritance. Technically, the money came from my dad. My grandparents were both doctors and bought property all over the city during their careers. Most of it was rented out, and it brought in a lot of cash. My dad passed away when I was 21 and left everything to my mom. It all stayed in her name during my marriage and for a few years after the divorce while she was still healthy. After my mom passed away, I inherited everything as her only heir. My wife didn't get anything in the divorce except alimony until she remarried a few years ago because my mom owned it all at the time, so my daughter never came close to owning any of it. She knew, of course, that her grandma was a landlord and had a couple of Airbnb properties, but I never touched that money because my construction business made more than enough for me to live comfortably. I hope I've answered all your questions. Also, my daughter hasn't contacted me since that night, and I don't think she will, to be honest. I think she made it pretty clear she only put on this whole act for the inheritance, and now that it's not an option, I don't expect to hear from her again. I'd be lying if I said I'm not upset about it at all, but by now, I know better than to expect too much from people, no matter who they are. So, that's where things stand, I guess. Thanks to everyone for the support, I really appreciate it. I also think it might be time for me to put myself out there, maybe start dating again, and find some companionship instead of waiting for ghosts from my past to show up. Update 2, it's been a wild week, folks. I thought my last update would be it, but life had other ideas. I'd just gotten home from work and was thinking about grabbing a beer with a couple of buddies when my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I opened the door, and there she was, my worst nightmare. She'd changed her hair and lost some weight, so it took me a second to recognize her, but it's hard to forget someone you spent decades with, ha! Seeing her was a real shock, to say the least. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, feeling awkward. She asked if I had a minute to talk about some things, and I was hesitant, but I didn't want her standing at my door, so I invited her in. It was super awkward, as you can imagine. We made small talk about this and that, and then she said she knew it was strange, but there were some things she needed to tell me. I told her to go ahead, and she said our daughter had reached out to her and told her about the inheritance. I kinda saw that coming. I mean, why else would she need to talk to me after all these years? Anyway, she said she understood the divorce hit me hard and that she took things too far back then. I just scoffed, but she ignored it. Then she said I shouldn't punish my daughter for what happened between us. She said the same stuff my daughter did, like how she was really young during the divorce and I can't hold it against her for picking her mom over me. I stopped her right there and said I don't hold any resentment toward anyone anymore, and even if I did, it wouldn't be toward her daughter. I told her it hurt to realize that, after all this time, the only reason my daughter thought to reach out was because there might be money in it for her. I said the same thing I told my daughter: if she'd tried to reconnect earlier, she would have gotten the inheritance. My ex tried to defend herself, but I told her my decision was final, and if they were just going to keep going in circles about this one thing, they were wasting everyone's time. I said I had plans and, if there was nothing else, she should probably leave. She nodded, apologized for bothering me, and I told her there was no need for that, and she left. After she was gone, I just sat there, stunned. I never thought I'd see her again, let alone talk in my own home. It was weird and brought up a lot of old memories I'd rather forget. I went out with my friends and tried to put it out of my mind. So, yeah, that happened, and I needed to get it off my chest. Thanks for sticking with me. If you're still reading, Update 3, I've got another update for you all. This afternoon, I was at work when my phone rang, and it was my daughter calling. I thought about letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. Right off the bat, I told her that if this was about the inheritance, there's no point in us talking. She said there was something else she wanted to discuss. I asked her to go on, and she said she'd been thinking a lot about everything and felt like she owed me an apology. She said she understood she should have handled things differently back then, and if I was willing to forgive her and give our relationship another try, she'd be happy to have me at her wedding. I was totally taken aback, to say the least. I asked if she was sure about this, and she said yes, and that I could take some time to think it over and let her know if I'd be there or not. I said, okay, and we hung up. Now I'm really confused. Part of me is thrilled at the idea of being at her wedding, but I can't shake the feeling that this might just be a way for her to get on my good side and eventually get the inheritance. At the same time, if she's being genuine, I don't want to mess up my chance to be in her life again. If I say no and she never reaches out again, I couldn't really blame her. I'd appreciate any advice if anyone wants to chime in an update for. I've made up my mind to go to the wedding. A lot of you said going couldn't hurt, and I figure that makes sense. It's not like I have to do anything in return just for being invited as a guest. And no, I'm not in the wedding party, I'll just be there as a regular attendee. I'm fine with that, since I understand jumping from not speaking for 8 years to walking her down the aisle would be a huge step, and I don't think either of us would feel comfortable with that. I really hope this marks the start of a new chapter for us, and we can build something meaningful together. Thanks to everyone for listening and for all the advice you've shared, I really appreciate it. I hope you all wish me luck.